Hello again, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us for this Thursday's edition of Alaska Weather. I'm Dave Percy, meteorologist with the National Weather Service, and I'll be hosting today's show. Up first, hazardous weather graphic showing this is about to become the no fire weather graphic. And fire danger really reduced. Now we just have a couple areas here that actually barely got into the high categories, kind of a stretch. One there on the central north slope right up toward the Brooks Range, and the other one over basically the Noatak Valley out to the coast, including Kivalina and I believe even Kotzebue in that zone. Otherwise, all the persistent rainfall, cloudy, cool conditions has pretty much eliminated any significant fire danger. Upper Yukon Valley, for example, or anywhere over the interior or southern Alaska. And from there, let's move on to the hazardous weather graphic, and we've got some illuminated areas on the chart here. Start out with the watch area, which is the one outside the Fairbanks. They're the warning area. So that's flood watch, and that's for the Tanana Valley through Friday afternoon. Tanana River, obviously on the Tanana Valley there, and also that's on the east side or the west side there around Tanana. As you head east over there on the in the 40 Mile Country, upper Tanana Valley, that's for the main stem rivers in the upper Tanana Valley, and that's a flood watch, which is also out until 4 p.m. Friday, and that means there's conditions are right for the potential is there that flooding could occur. Now, in the case of the warning area there, that's really not delineated too well. I don't have that scale that on the graphic here that actually shows it's not flood warning for the entire Fairbanks area, but it is a flood warning for the Good Pasture River, the Chena and Salsa rivers, as well as two rivers. So there's flood warnings for those particular rivers, and that's out through tomorrow afternoon as well. So from there, moving on to the rest of the state, really looking good as far as watches, warnings, and advisories go. Now, moving on to satellites, here you can see a system moving onshore, the Panhandle there, and then kind of another enhancement of the clouds coming onshore here on the last frame, tending to enhance the rainfall, but keeping it cloudy and cool there. And then moisture wrapping back along the North Gulf Coast, and then down into Kodiak Island, where Kodiak State Airport was reporting north winds gusting almost to 30 miles an hour with light rain and fog. And they've picked up about 0.4 of an inch in the last 24 hours at Kodiak. And by contrast, over toward the main storm area where the heaviest moisture was, Yakutat had over an inch of rain, and then lighter amounts than that, mainly down the Panhandle, but pretty widespread all the way to Dixon Entrance, for example. Ketchikan picking up 1/3 of an inch of precipitation. Otherwise, I've got clouds covering much of all of interior Alaska today with rain, kind of a soaking rains, widespread area of rain. Some areas seeing heavier amounts than others, but just about the entire interior of Alaska had some measurable precipitation. The exception being the North Slope area and back to the northwest a little bit there, but 1/3 of an inch of precipitation fell at Eagle, for example, and then you go out to Galena. They also had about 1/3 of an inch of precipitation as well, and Ambler there in the Kobuk Valley under the heavier clouds picked up 1/2 an inch of rain. So again, widespread areas of rather significant rainfall, and of course that's why there's flood watches and warnings out there in the upper Tanana Valley area. That's all due to rainfall. And for the area to the southwest, you can see clouds trailing into the Bristol Bay area. It was a wet day, cloudy day, cool across the southwest interior, as well as the Alaska Peninsula, rain falling Cold Bay, with northwest winds gusting to about 35 miles an hour there. Otherwise, Bering Sea, lighter winds, but considerable low clouds, fog, areas of drizzle, areas of IFR. And it looks like a little better there up towards St. Lawrence Island. In Bering Strait, usual weather, cloudy, foggy, but winds are on the light side. And you can see clouds gathering over the Russian Far East associated with a 997 millibar low out there. That's beginning to push some moisture, actually pushing a trough eastward there, and that's over the central Bering Sea, spreading moisture in toward the Pribilof Islands. But pretty weak, wind's not a factor at all out over the Bering Sea. And of course that results in low clouds and fog to become a little more widespread than they otherwise would be if there was more wind and lift to the atmosphere. Otherwise, we've got trough keeping it cloudy and wet. Troughs are from a low center up over the Brooks Range, and the trough axis extending all the way down to Togiak Bay and actually the western Alaska Peninsula, with showers there and rain and showers there over the western interior, and some thunderstorm development at mid-afternoon. Really not all that widespread, but a couple areas there up along the trough in the Koyukuk Valley toward the southern slopes of the Brooks Range, over toward the eastern interior, and then all the way down toward roughly around Denali Park. A few strikes reported there in the western Alaska Range. And then we had kind of another wet, cool, showery day for the North Gulf Coast. And I mentioned Kodiak Island with that front right along the coastline. They're keeping it rather windy. Could be some minimum gales associated with that front, especially along the North Gulf Coast today, south of Prince William Sound, the entrance there. But rain from Queen Charlotte's all the way up, as I mentioned, Yakutat picking up over an inch, and then that kind of tapering off as you head westward with lighter amounts becoming more scattered, especially up over the Tanana Valley, northern Copper River Basin area, and then a little clouds and fog out to the west. That tonight really won't change much out there. Pretty significant low center now entering the northwest Bering Sea. They're still along the coast of the Russian Far East. With look for increasing wind, especially for Gamble tonight. May jump up to small craft advisory levels toward morning with low clouds, fog, and increasing chances of light rain and drizzle. Should be a fair night for the Seward Peninsula, and much drier over the interior. Looks like only showers from the central Arctic coast along that trough. Pretty isolated and scattered. A little bit more widespread there with the 1,009 millibar low in the trough over the Kuskokwim Valley and Delta area to the Kuskokwim Mountains into the Aucklands, and then isolated as you get down toward the Alaska Peninsula. But wet periods of rain for the southeast coast, and chance of rain for the North Gulf Coast. Amounts there will be lighter with rainfall more intermittent, generally cloudy. Could be a few breaks over the interior, but looking a lot drier. And the Aleutians, chance of drizzle for the central area is otherwise basically dry. Light winds continue, but again, as I mentioned, picking up there over the north and northwest Bering Sea with that low center. That low center develops a pretty good front that'll bring gusty winds, maybe as high as 35, possibly 40 miles an hour across St. Lawrence Island and Bering Strait, with rain and fog associated with it that'll move into the western Seward Peninsula. Looks like rain will spread to the Yukon Delta, but not quite as much wind, and it'll be generally a cloudy, damp day even over the Kuskokwim Delta. Bristol Bay, mostly cloudy, isolated showers in toward Iliamna, Aleutian Range, becoming more widespread. Looks cloudy and damp over south central Alaska and the North Gulf Coast. Weak low pressure keeps it cloudy, cool, and occasionally damp for the Panhandle. Otherwise, eastern interior kind of in a dry zone there, escaping any shower activity. You're going to see a lot of cloudiness, and those thunderstorms again developing along the Brooks Range, that trough axis down into the Kuskokwim Valley, but nothing really widespread, and even possibility seeing some thunderstorm activity over the Talkeetna Mountains. And a pretty good storm system spread some rain right up to the central Aleutians, but staying far enough to the south, we'll see it swings northeastward right across the Fox Islands Saturday afternoon and weekends, with a good shot of moisture and wind coming up the Alaska Peninsula, spreading into Bristol Bay, and that area of rainfall will link up with that system there to the coming across the Bering Sea with the gusty winds and rain. Slow moving system, kind of stalling out as the front makes landfall. High pressure, looks like a drier day with some afternoon thunderstorm activity over the Alaska Range. Looks also drier for the Panhandle, maybe some clearing. Lows tonight, 30s and 40s, coolest on the Arctic coast. And for the highs, tomorrow, much like today, really not a lot of change. Warm spot today at 3 p.m. this afternoon was 71 degrees at Umiat Airfield, and Beaver had 70, and we're looking about the same tomorrow, maybe lower 70s there for the upper Yukon Valley, possibly Fairbanks reaching 70, but no summer heat at all forecast anywhere or in the near forecast. Highs in the 40s for the Aleutians. And then lows Saturday morning, 40s, except lower 50s upper Yukon Valley, with generally 40s everywhere else, maybe near 50 for the Panhandle. That'll be followed by highs Saturday afternoon. Really not much change, 65 to 70, and maybe pushing 70 or into the low 70s south central Alaska, otherwise 60s for the Panhandle.
And now, aviation weather around Alaska.
Moving on to flying weather Friday morning, we've got some marginal VFR along the central Arctic coast, but the north slope. VFR, most of the Brooks Range VFR, looks like some marginal VFR there over the Kobuk Valley and the southern slopes of the mountains, otherwise VFR down, and then you get some areas of marginal VFR across southern Alaska. A little more most widespread there for the eastern and north Gulf Coast, from the Kenai Peninsula on up and across the eastern Copper River Basin. IFR for all of the Panhandle, some IFR over the western Bering and just grazing the west central Aleutians, otherwise marginal VFR for the Aleutians, Alaska Peninsula, right on up to the southwest coast. Friday afternoon, area of IFR holds out over the western Aleutians, extending northeastward to St. Matthew Island, but staying north of the western Aleutians, where it'll be marginal VFR from Kiska Island eastward to the Alaska Peninsula and almost all of Bristol Bay, but not making it up to the northeast. Marginal VFR, Western Alaska Range, possibly some marginal VFR developing due to convection over the Talkeetna Mountains, as well as the Wrangell Mountains looks marginal. Marginal VFR Seward Peninsula up to Point Hope, and not bad. Arctic coast is about all VFR as well as the North Slope and right on into the interior. Panhandle, though, marginal VFR with areas of IFR. And for Saturday morning, looking good up on the Arctic coast, North Slope, Brooks Range into the interior. Just looking at some marginal VFR along the central western Alaska Range, and again, possibly the Talkeetnas. Eastern Copper River Basin from the eastern Alaska Range, right on down to the coastline, and Yakutat could be IFR, and pretty IFR conditions likely for the Panhandle, Bering Sea, and Aleutians, IFR for the Aleutians, and mostly over the northern western Bering Sea for the IFR, otherwise marginal, that pushes eastward and inland right up to the Kuskokwim Mountains across St. Lawrence Island and into the northwest interior. Saturday afternoon, marginal VFR, western interior, and VFR, central and eastern interior. VFR from the Arctic coast southward to the Gulf of Alaska, Prince William Sound VFR. Kodiak Island looking good, as well as Bristol Bay, but Trinity Island, Sitkinak, marginal VFR, south side of the Alaska Peninsula IFR, and IFR slipping on into the eastern central Aleutians and southwest Bering Sea with marginal VFR for the Panhandle. Passes Anatuvik and Adigan, occasionally, or mostly, will be VFR throughout the day, and Lake Clark and Merrill, occasional marginal VFR, possible throughout any time of the day. Same forecast for rainy, kind of marginal. Windy, starting out VFR, possibly becoming marginal with building convection, risk of a thunderstorm later in the day. That same trend and forecast also good for Isabel as well as Mentesta. And Tanita, although less of a threat, I think thunderstorms are just a slight risk there. They'll probably stay off to the north, but still could build clouds to marginal VFR type conditions. Portage VFR, but marginal VFR possible in the morning on the east entrance, becoming VFR, so looking pretty good for that pass. Chilkoot and White, IFR, trending toward marginal VFR. And the freezing levels, cold air now back to the west over Russia, so we've got kind of a cool pocket 4,000 feet down the west coast, almost to the Alaska Peninsula. Otherwise, right around 6,000 feet over most of interior Alaska and the Panhandle. And for icing, got a system coming out of the Russian Far East there with that frontal boundary, the thermal gradient along it, and some rime icing possible of the light to very isolated variety to the Bering Strait, western Seward Peninsula across St. Lawrence Island, and down across St. Matthew Island. Otherwise, over the interior, just areas of mixed freezing levels, say 10,000 feet, give or take, more of a convective nature of the precipitation, and also for the southeast coast. And for the jet stream, two flows there with a cold air over the Russian Far East. We've got a jet, westerlies 100 diminishing to 50 knots as it moves across the Bering Strait, and even lighter up across the northwest or western Arctic coast, and a series of upper level lows there over the interior. That keeping the Pacific jet mostly to the south of the forecast area, but it does nose up, ridges up into the Alaska Peninsula. 9,000 feet, light winds over the interior, the storm over the Russian Far East. That's where the strongest winds will be in both cases, and that's where the bumpiest ride will be from the Seward Peninsula to Cape Lisburne.
Howdy, summer stars. Trace here. It is the June solstice, the first day of summer and the longest day of the year in the northern hemisphere. Solstice comes from the Latin sol for sun and sistere for to stand still. It appears to happen because the Earth wobbles on our axis, called an axial tilt. This means the northern hemisphere tilts toward the sun in June and away in December. The axial tilt is why we have seasons, and not like some think, because of the distance from the sun to the Earth. Earth's tilt was thought to be caused by a great impact, perhaps by Theia, which is the object that hit the Earth and spun off to create the moon. All our planets have tilts, so each one has a solstice and seasons, but the further out you are, the longer each season will be by Earth reckoning. Heck, Neptune's last summer solstice was in 1913. Keep looking up.
Welcome back to another edition of Alaska Weather Facts. I'm meteorologist Dave Snider, and joining me once again is Cindy Preller. She is the Tsunami Program Manager for the National Weather Service in Alaska region. Thanks for joining us again, Cindy.
Thank you, Dave.
We're talking about tsunami awareness and safety here in Alaska especially, and one of the things that has been one of your main focuses is the Tsunami Ready program. What is that, and how do Alaskans find out more?
Awesome. Yeah, Tsunami Ready is a National Weather Service hosted program in partnership with Storm Ready.
Okay.
And it is a program that we conduct with our partners in the state, but it's mostly community driven. So if a community wants to become tsunami ready, well, the first thing they need to do is get a hold of me or their local WCM at a weather forecast office or their tsunami team at the state level.
So, and this is something that's a NOAA grant, so there's money available to help encourage the preparedness at the local level there in the city or the village.
Yeah.
What are some of the places that have done this already?
Oh, our oldest tsunami ready city is Seward,
Good.
you know, but also Sitka, Homer, Valdez are the, the main players, but we've got several tsunami ready communities that I'm very proud of. It takes several years to accomplish this. And so a few of the things that they do is the tsunami risk will be assessed by someone like me or another scientist will help find out, really what their probability is. We'll create an inundation map, an evacuation map. They'll have a mitigation plan. We will set up some partnerships with the schools, make an evacuation shelter, and then they need to practice. But it is the city that owns the program, really. It's up to them. And many cities would like to have sirens, and so we help them get those. And, and they practice. They have to practice.
Sure. So let's say I'm driving into a place like Seward that's tsunami ready. What are some of the things I should look for as maybe a visitor so I know maybe where I need to go or can be more aware of my tsunami risk?
Absolutely. The tsunami ready signage is really blatant. It's this, blue and white curling wave sign, and there's different shapes of signs that'll show you if you are in the hazard zone or where the evacuation routes are and when you're out of shelter.
Okay. So this is a multi-step process that helps the residents be more aware of their own risk, but then also prepare for when that risk arrives.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And, many communities sound their sirens daily, some sound them weekly, to make sure everybody knows what they mean. And there's often drills. We have an annual drill once a year. We have Tsunami Awareness Preparedness Week, and that's a good time for each community to do some exercising.
Okay. And is this a program that is unique to Alaska?
Absolutely not. It's national.
Okay.
And all over the country, you'll have the same signage, so it's consistent.
Good. So if I'm taking the kids to California, I should be able to see something familiar.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. And, you know, some communities hesitate because they think it'll discourage tourism. And so I would like to tell those communities that what they're actually doing is they're encouraging responsibility.
Sure.
The tsunami's going to happen.
Right.
And it's going to hit every coastline. So, you know, it's not about when, it'll be any time. So the fact that they're showing tourists that they are making steps to be prepared for this, I think would encourage people to want to stay there.
Right. And that would be no different than, say, you or I visiting the Midwest, where we know there's going to be really bad thunderstorms and maybe there's a risk for tornadoes. We're aware of that risk when we go there.
Absolutely. If I see a sign for a tornado shelter, I'm going to remember that.
Right. Okay. All right. So we're just doing a better job of being more prepared with something that's bound to happen again.
I hope so.
Okay. Very good. Where can people go again to learn more about the Tsunami Ready program here in Alaska?
Well, one, there's a Tsunami Ready website. So, you know, just Tsunami Ready, and
Google
that'll
Tsunami
get you
Ready.
there.
Okay.
And then probably the best person for people to contact is their warning coordination meteorologist at their local weather forecast office, which is Anchorage or Juneau, most likely.
Okay. All right. So most of the folks along the Bering Sea coast, again, are not at a huge risk for tsunamis at this
No,
point.
they don't need to worry about it.
Okay,
Thank
very
you.
good. But always learning to be prepared no matter where you are in Alaska, no matter what the risk, always a good step. And tsunami is a major player in that, as we well know from events like 1964.
Alaskans are resilient. I really believe in them.
Very good, very good. Well, Cindy, thank you so much for joining us again, and please make an effort to learn more about the Tsunami Ready program in your village and town if you haven't already. We'll be back with Cindy again next time to talk more about the Tsunami Warning Center in Palmer, Alaska. We actually have a group of geologists working for the National Weather Service, so scratch your head on that one and we'll join you next time. I'll see you next time on Alaska Weather Packs.
And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Welcome back. I'm meteorologist Carrie Hazley with a look at marine weather conditions across the state, starting off with the most recent sea ice forecast. The 5-day forecast issued from our sea ice program yesterday afternoon shows that we have a small area of ice holding on to the northern part of the Seward Peninsula, stretching between Wales over towards Kotzebue Sound. We will look for that little bit of ice that's remaining there to dissipate over the next couple of days, probably the next 36 hours. We should see all of that ice be gone, leaving all of what's left up in the actual Arctic itself. There is an area with less than 80% concentration from the Alcan border over towards Kaktovik, and with the wind direction there in the next couple of days, we'll actually look for that area of less concentration to currently work its way a bit further westward, marching its way closer to Prudhoe Bay, with ice mostly holding on between Prudhoe Bay and Utqiagvik. Now, as far as other conditions go, it's been an active day across the Gulf of Alaska and the Panhandle. Getting into the day on Friday, conditions do start to improve. We will see an onshore flow over most of the Panhandle tomorrow with winds between 15 and 20 knots and seas between 6 and 7 feet, and then a bit calmer conditions inside the interior waters. By the time we get to Saturday morning, we do see the winds start to pick up more out of the northwest across all of the area, between 15 and 20 knots, depending on whether you're into the interior waters or on the outside, and then with seas up to about 8 feet, 9 feet along the coast there. Over towards the south central area for the day tomorrow, we do see winds out of primarily the west. We see some southwest winds up in the northern part of Cook Inlet, ranging between 15 and 20 knots. And then over in the north part of the Gulf of Alaska, we do see some areas with winds up to about 25 knots, seas between 7 and 10 feet, depending on where you're at in that area. And then not a lot of change as we get into the day on Saturday. Winds stay primarily out of the southwest across most of this area, up to about 25 knots. And then over the northern part of Cook Inlet, winds out of the south up to 15. The southwestern part of Cook Inlet up to about 20 knots. Moving further west to take a look at the Alaska Peninsula and Kodiak Island, starting with Kodiak Island for the day tomorrow, winds out of the west up to about 25 knots. This is where we also see the highest seas for this particular region, up to about 8 feet. Once we get over towards the peninsula and then into Bristol Bay, seas drop off a bit, about 4 feet for most of the seas there, and then winds 15 to 20 knots. knots. Winds shift directions as we get into the day on Saturday, where we do see primarily southerly winds along the Alaska Peninsula, southwesterly winds over towards Kodiak Island, and everything up to about 15-20 knots, although when you get over towards Sandpoint on the Pacific side, we will look for some of the winds to be up as high as 30 knots, seas up to about 12 feet, and that's really a hint of what's to come as we get into the days ahead in the weekend. Further out the Aleutians, starting the day on Friday, winds mostly out of the east there, up to 10 to 15 knots in most places, seas between 3 and 5 feet. Into the day on Saturday, again, we see more hints of kind of what's to come as another weather system is starting to push its way up from the south, the Pacific side. Then we see our winds and our waves picking up. About 13 feet just south of Nikolsky for the waves there, and then 25 to 30 knots for most of the wind on Saturday out in the far western part of the Aleutians. Further up the coast, we also have active weather as we've got an area of low pressure pushing its way towards the west coast of Alaska as we go into the start of the weekend. So we see winds and waves picking up in this area as well, just south of St. Lawrence Island on Friday. Due southerly winds 25 to 35 knots and seas up as high as about 12 feet just south of St. Lawrence Island there. And then that frontal boundary pushes on shore, and by the time we get into Saturday, we see some drop off as far as our seas go, but those winds really do stay up to about 30 knots for most of that time frame. Seas there between 8 and 9 feet. Now up to the Arctic, we do have that ice holding on up over most of the Arctic, so we're not dealing with waves up in that area, but those easterly winds are what are going to kind of pushing that area where we've got lower ice concentration further to the west. So in the Arctic, there are winds between 10 and 15 knots, and then as we get over to the west coast there, we have pretty gusty winds up to 35 knots, seas up to 11 feet for the day on Friday. And then going into Saturday, we see some of those waves starting to subside, where 8 to 9 feet seems to be the prevailing condition in the places where we've got open water, but winds stay high off the west coast up to 35 knots. And then up in the Arctic, those easterly winds continue between 10 and 15 knots for most places. And just a quick recap now, there is an area of low pressure out across the Gulf of Alaska and a frontal boundary quickly pushing its way towards the Panhandle, where we will see widespread rain across the Panhandle, the Gulf Coast, and parts of the eastern Kenai Peninsula. As we get into the day tomorrow, most of that system starts to weaken. The next weather maker is going to be out along the west coast as the frontal boundary pushes its way in. We also see a few lightning strikes develop as we get into the day on Friday across much of the interior. Have a great night.
These forecasts are for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal, pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating.